Well, hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us for this online message this weekend at Deep Rivers Church. Check the email that this link came with. It's full of information. Wednesday night is Prayer House. That might be your next step to come join us. Thursday morning is a Women's Connect group. Thursday night is a Men's Connect group. Friday morning is a Men's Connect group. This coming Saturday is the second Saturday of the month, so we will have our second Saturday men's breakfast at Soda Jerk. The back deck will be open, and so 8 o'clock Saturday morning, guys, come and enjoy breakfast on the back deck. All right, when I was a kid, I went to Sunday school, and they had these things called flannel graphs, which were visual aids to help teachers keep the little kids involved in the story. So there was like a piece of felt, and then they put the background, and then they put the biblical characters on there, and they just kind of acted out the story. Today's text really is part of one of these great Old Testament flannel graph stories, okay? This is the story of Mount Carmel and Elijah and the prophets of Baal. So the people of Israel start worshiping Baal, who's an idol, false god. So Elijah is a prophet of God. He says, listen, why don't we have a contest? You build your altar, I'll build my altar. Whoever's God brings down fire from heaven, that'll be the true God. So the prophets of Baal, they set up their altar, they chant all day, they start, cutting themselves, doing all this kind of crazy stuff. No fire from heaven. Then Elijah says, well, here's my altar, and then he douses it with a ton of water, okay, just to prove a point. And then fire comes down, and Elijah's altar is, his sacrifice is consumed with fire from heaven. Then right after that, the prophets of Baal are killed, and it seems like a great victory. So this is what happens. We're talking about disappointment with God. Elijah had a great disappointment after this great victory, and there's a lot we can learn when we talk about disappointment. So this is what happens in 1 Kings chapter 19, right after this great victory on Mount Carmel. It says, now Ahab told Jezebel everything that Elijah had done and how he had killed the prophets with the sword. So Jezebel sent a messenger to Elijah to say, may the gods, small g, may the gods deal with me, be it ever so severely, if by this time tomorrow I do not make your life like one of them. Elijah was afraid and ran for his life. When he came to Beersheba in Judah, he left his servant there, while he himself went on a day's journey into the wilderness. He came to a bush, sat down under it, and prayed that he might die. I've had enough, Lord, take my life. I am no better than my ancestors. Then he lay down under the bush and fell asleep. All at once an angel touched him and said, get up and eat. He looked around, and there by his head was some bread baked over hot coals and a jar of water. He ate and drank and lay down again. The angel of the Lord came back a second time and touched him and said, get up and eat, for the journey is too much for you. So he got up and ate and drank. Strengthened by that food, he traveled 40 days and 40 nights until he reached Mount Oreb, the mountain of God. There he went into a cave and spent the night. So we're talking about disappointment in God. That's our current sermon series. This is our second week in it. Elijah has this great victory, and then he has this great disappointment after it. The people, Israel, they see God rain down fire from heaven and consume an altar and a sacrifice that's drenched in water. The prophets of Baal are all dead. It's finally raining. It doesn't tell you about that part of the story. There was a drought in the land, and then after this happens, there's big rains that come. So all of his hard work is rewarded with revival and the nation turning back to God, right? No, after this big confrontation, there is no revival. In fact, there's a death sentence put on his head. Instead of the nation turning to God, this vengeful queen just wants him dead. Elijah is disappointed, and that's putting it mildly. He maybe a better word would be devastated. He sees himself as a failure, so much so he wants to die. I have had enough, Lord. Take my life. This is not how he thought it would turn out. This does not turn out the way that he expected. So he runs in fear. So what is God's response to Elijah's disappointment? First, we ought to know he does not rebuke Elijah for being scared. He doesn't rebuke Elijah for being human. All right, the queen wants him dead, so he runs. He doesn't get a rebuke. He does provide for his needs. 2 times this runaway prophet is given a hot meal and a drink. And as we'll see in a moment, he does speak to Elijah in a loving and kind whisper. God has this conversation with him. This is the second part of 1 Kings 19, verses 10 through 18. So God says to him when he's in this cave, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" He replied. And Elijah replied, "I have been very zealous for the Lord Almighty. The Israelites have rejected your covenant, torn down your altars, and put your prophets to death with the sword. I am the only one left, and now they are trying to kill me too." The Lord said, "Go and stand on the mountain in the presence of the Lord, for the Lord is about to pass by." Then a great and powerful wind tore the mountains apart and shattered the rocks before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. After the wind, there came an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. After the earthquake came a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire came a gentle whisper. When Elijah heard it, he pulled his cloak over his face and went out and stood at the mouth of the cave. The Lord said, "Go back the way you came and go to the desert of Damascus. When you get there, anoint Hazael, king over Aram, and Jehu, king over Israel, and anoint Elisha to succeed you as a prophet. I have reserved 7,000 in Israel, all whose knees have not bowed down to Baal, and whose mouths have not kissed him." Before we get into the disappointment with God part, I just wanted to make a point. When I was preparing the message, I was kind of tempted, because it really doesn't have anything to do with the story, I was kind of tempted to edit out, whose mouths have not kissed him. God said, "I have reserved 7,000 people in Israel, all whose knees have not bowed down to Baal." And you could end it right there. But the text goes on to say, "whose mouths have not kissed him." And like I said, I could have edited it out. It doesn't really, it's not really that vital to the story. But the fact that the text says, "whose mouths have not kissed him," a kiss is a form of intimacy. And it just kind of drives the point home that idolatry is a big problem. It graphically shows the betrayal when we pursue other things. Now, the Hebrew people, the nation of Israel, they were pursuing Baal instead of God. Now, we don't have the same kind of idol worship that they do, but there is an infidelity, really, when we turn to other things. And so I thought that's pretty interesting. Okay, hold on. Oh. Sorry, my sermon notes fell down. All right. So Elijah's disappointment, almost a depression, if you will. He says, "Lord, take my life." Basically, he prayed to die. This mighty man of prayer, after he does this, there's rain after 3.5 years. There's fire from heaven, and the result is he wants to die. So thankfully, this prayer is not answered. And ironically, if you know, Elijah never does die. He's praying to die, and the reality is in 2 Kings we see that he was caught up to heaven. So this no from God can obviously be better than a yes, and that's true for us as well. Elijah hoped that the events of Mount Carmel would turn around Ahab and Jezebel, the leadership of Israel, and the whole nation of Israel, but unfortunately, Elijah forgot that people often reject God despite the evidence, not because of the evidence. When Elijah examined his apparent failure, he instinctively set blame on his own unworthiness. He says, "I'm just like my ancestors." He's saying He's a sinner. He's just like those who have gone before him. Basically, in some sense, he's saying he didn't do enough to earn more. Basically, I'm saying I'm no different than the people who've come before me. I'm nobody special. I haven't done enough to earn a better outcome, and that's why he's disappointed. So God ministers to Elijah. I mentioned it already. He first cared for Elijah's physical needs. Again, sometimes we need some rest and replenishment. When we are disappointed, we are people as a country, we don't take very good care of ourselves. We probably don't get enough sleep. We don't always eat well. So there's something to be said for that, the physical element of it. So God took care of Elijah's physical needs. It was gracious for God to deal like this with his servant. We might have expected a rebuke or a correction and not such a loving and kind treatment as this. God allows Elijah to vent his frustrations. This is important. He asks, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" Now, God knows the answer. But it was good for Elijah to speak and to speak freely and unburden his heart. Again, Lamentations is a book that we have in the Bible. It's a book of lament. And as we mentioned last week, it's not so much what we do, it's how we do it. We are encouraged to be honest with God. We just have to be aware of how we're doing it, okay? Not a complaining, grumbling spirit, but this is really hard, and I could use your help. Elijah went on to say, "I have been very zealous for you, and now look at the danger I'm in." To Elijah, and many servants since, it seemed unfair that a faithful servant should suffer. Why do we think that we're immune from suffering, even if we're doing good things? I alone am left, and again, this is just not accurate, but it reflected his feelings. Discouraging times, hard things, can make us feel like we're isolated and alone. Strangely, the reasons why Elijah wants to die are actually important reasons for him to live. If he's the last prophet, like he thinks he's the last one, if he's the last prophet that is alive, he should want to live as long as possible. If his enemy wanted him dead, Jezebel wants him dead, if his enemy wants him dead, he should do all he can to not comply to her wishes. It's interesting. He's fearful that Jezebel's going to kill him, and his prayer is, go ahead, kill me. Elijah showed the unreasonable nature of unbelief and fear and disappointment. When our emotions get the better of us, reason, the unreasonable nature pops through. Unbelief and fear and disappointment. So God then reveals himself to Elijah. God knew what Elijah needed. He needed a personal encounter with him. There's nothing wrong with Elijah's theology or his knowledge, but there was something lacking, and that was a personal experience. He saw God do great things, fire from heaven, but in this time, this moment, what he needed was an encounter with God. Not just a great experience. God brought his presence to Elijah, but first he showed Elijah where he was not. He was not seen in a mighty wind. He was not seen in a great earthquake. And again, he was not seen in fire. And here's the point. This is where it applies to all of us. We often only look for God in dramatic signs, but he most often appears in less dramatic ways. This quote kind of drives that point home. This same lesson has to be learned by all of us. Not by might, not by power, but by my spirit, says the Lord. That's Zechariah 4:6. We too often fall into the trap of looking for displays of power of one kind or another. And when that happens, his still small voice can be hushed and silent. So God does reveal himself to Elijah, but not in a mighty way, but in a whisper. Then God gives Elijah work to do. He says, you need to return You need to anoint and you need to appoint. Go back to where you came from. You need to stop looking at yourself and your circumstances, which are admittedly very hard. But he needed to go and get on with God, with what God wanted him to do. And then there is the assurance that God gives to Elijah. Jehu is going to be king. That means he's going to succeed the corrupt King Ahab and Jezebel. Elisha is going to be his new friend and successor. And again, that God let him know that someone's ready to learn from this great prophet and to be his disciple and his companion. So Elijah knew that his work would continue. This phrase, 7,000 people that have not bowed to Baal, it shows Elijah that his quiet ministry over the years bore more fruit than possibly the spectacular ministry at Mount Carmel. So Elijah learned some key lessons. When Elijah was disappointed with God, he learned that God had a different plan than his. Elijah wanted revival. God had a different plan. When Elijah was upset that God didn't do what he expected, God told him that he doesn't always work in the way that the prophet expected. What are our expectations? Isaiah 55, 8-9, my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are my ways your ways. As the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts. I guess the bottom line is that God has a plan. And as we know, that plan is much bigger than Elijah expected. It's much bigger than the nation of Israel. God's ultimate plan was to offer salvation to the world. Elijah also learned that God works in impressive ways, obviously fire from heaven, and we need to pray into that. We need to pray for impressive ways, obvious ways, physical ways for God to be at work visibly. But also God works in quiet and small ways, in a still small whisper of a voice. So the challenge is what happens when we get disappointed. More succinctly, what happens when we get disappointed with God? So the question again, like last week, is, are you disappointed with God? How are you disappointed with God? It might be more of a yes-no. How are you? No, it's not a yes-no. It's how are you disappointed? Have you run away like Elijah did? Now, you might not have physically run to a cave, but how have you withdrawn? How have you kind of held God at an arm's length because of your disappointment? How has your disappointment in God affected you, impacted you? Before Jonah was a sinking prophet, we know what happened to Jonah sinking in the whale experience. Before Jonah was a sinking prophet, he was a running prophet. He rejected God's plan. Again, Jonah is one of the most intriguing characters to me. God tells him to go share God with these people that Jonah hates. Jonah rejected God's plan. We have to be open for God's plan, not just ours. When we're upset, when we're disappointed in God, we can learn from Elijah that God doesn't always work the way that we want or even expect. He doesn't do what we want, what we would want him to do, or what do we think he should do. God doesn't always work in ways that we want. Again, Elijah expected revival, but he also expected God probably to be seen in the earthquake, the wind, and the fire. But God works in whispers. He can and does use other things to bring people back to him. He didn't use fire from heaven, but there were 7,000 people that were faithful. There were 2 new kings, 1 new prophet, and ultimately a baby born in Bethlehem is the fulfillment of his ultimate plan. It's difficult. It's really hard. I understand. We've all had disappointments, big and small. We've all prayed for healing, and it didn't happen. We all suffer from, in the past and current, broken relationships. Money health, other things can be a disappointment for us. Life is most often not a happily ever after. And this leaves us disillusioned and disheartened and maybe even angry with God. I don't know, enough to even want to die. Elijah was disappointed with God, but it's because he thought God was limited. It was the ultimate assumption that God's plans could not be better than his. You see, when we think our plans are better than God's, we're limiting him. We're putting limits on God because our plans have to be better than his. We can't make plans and then expect God to follow us. Bottom line, I guess, is another bottom line is, God is not safe or predictable. As C.S. Lewis said, he's not a tame lion. He isn't safe, but he's good. And again, we see that goodness ultimately in the cross. So, to wrap up, when we face disappointment, I think there's three things that could possibly be happening. This first one we can learn from Elijah. Our strong emotions are overruling our reason and distorting the reality of the situation. No doubt. He was fearful. That's an emotional response. Okay, even though he saw God do great things, he still got caught up in his emotions. So our strong emotions overrule our reason. The second thing that might be happening when you're disappointed is that God is refining and building your character. Deeper roots build houses on rock and not the sand. Jesus has a parable about building your house on a rock and not something that's shifting like sand. And character, deep roots, enable us to build our house on something secure. And the last one, that God has a different and better plan. Our expectations deny his ability to do better than us. So again, I hope you find this helpful as you look back on past disappointments, that God's plans are better. And I hope it's even helpful if you're walking through a disappointment right now. Again, thanks so much for joining us. Take care. God bless.